want to thank New York University and the Foreign Policy Association for having me, and thank you all for coming. I think one of the hardest things in talking about the Egyptian revolution is where to begin. How do you begin to frame something that I believe is a 100-year event? I think the significance of the Arab Spring or the Arab Awakening has that level of historical importance. And I was trying to think very hard about where do you begin to unpack history in motion? How do you begin to take that apart? So I thought I'd begin where I want to end this conversation. And that is to say, it's very easy to feel cynical about what is happening, particularly in Egypt right now. It's very easy, and I hear very often from my friends in Egypt that they're disheartened, that they feel that all of the excitement of Tahrir Square, the incredible emotion of seeing young people organized through Facebook, come together in the streets and take down a dictatorship, a police state, was an amazing event. But where are they now? And you can feel as if we've gone all the way back to where this whole thing began, where we have, again, a military junta in charge, again, a country that's yearning for democracy and struggling to get there. And it can seem like not much has happened. But I want to end with a sense of optimism and a sense of hope, because that's what I hear from the streets of Egypt when I am there. And I was there for most of the summer. I was just speaking downstairs to the security guard, the guy at the front desk who let you all in and who you showed your ID to. He's Egyptian. He feels that sense of hope. Many, many young journalists who I've gotten to know in the last few years stay in very close touch with me, and they definitely have their moments of despair, but they also are holding on to this promise of what Egypt can be. And I think it's exciting. So I'm gonna let you know that's where I want to end up. But where we start could be anywhere in the last 100 years. You could go back at least to October 6th, 1981, the assassination of Anwar Sadat. You've seen the video clip, the military parade. Sadat is viewing the parade. Islamists break from the military, come forward, and kill the president. And there is his vice president, Hosni Mubarak, ducking under the stands, survives. Sadat is killed. Mubarak goes on to become president. That is not a bad starting point, because this event in Tahrir Square really was about Mubarak, and it was about a police state, and it was about a pretty brutal and corrupt government that ruled for 30 years with the United States support, with very significant financial aid throughout all those years. So I don't think that's a bad starting point. For me as a journalist, my starting point really is February 1993. It was in February 1993 that I was a police reporter here in New York City, working for the New York Daily News. I covered the streets of New York. I loved that job. I love this city. And there was a very loud bang in Lower Manhattan. It was 1993, and there was smoke pouring out of the World Trade Center parking garage. And I was one of the very first reporters there. I did what you do when you're a reporter. You very confidently nod, holding a yellow legal pad, and walk right past the police lines. And I got right up to the edge of where the smoke was coming out of the garage, and we saw that this was a 6-story deep crater. The cars all caved in, water spraying everywhere, smoke, fire. No one on the outside was thinking that was a bomb, not the police or the firemen. They were thinking it's a subway crash or a generator that exploded, or there were all kinds of explanations, but no one said it's terrorism, it's a bomb, which says a lot about that time, 1993. I had covered Medellin, Colombia, and I had also covered Northern Ireland, and I knew what a bombing looked like. When I saw that parking garage, I knew this was a bombing, and I was shocked. It took about 12 hours to get that confirmed, but there was no question this was a bombing. That led me to reporting out who were the suspects in this bombing, who wanted to take down the World Trade Center in 1993. And as we began to do our reporting, it led us to Brooklyn, and it led us to Jersey City, and it led us to the spiritual head of this group of New Yorkers, many of them taxi drivers and just working people, immigrants from different parts of the Muslim world who wanted to blow up the World Trade Center. And it led back to an Egyptian, Sheikh Omar Abdel Rahman. This is the blind Egyptian cleric who was based in both Brooklyn and Jersey City mosques. He'd been thrown out of Egypt. He was a militant. And he was a militant who was in league with Ayman al-Zawahiri, who was also an Egyptian militant who had broken away, splintered from some of the Egyptian factions, and had teamed up with this guy in 1993 no one had really heard of. He was known as the Emir, and I kept hearing about him, that he may have been this guy who financed this World Trade Center bombing, 1993. So my editor said, you should go, man. You should go do this story. So I did. I went to Egypt. I went to the Sudan. I started to follow the trail of the suspects. It was a police story. And as we followed that trail, we came to Sudan, and there was this emir, about 6'3", 6'4", big long beard, described as the scion of a construction family in Saudi Arabia. And his name was Osama bin Laden. Bin Laden, in 1993, was in the Sudan, and we were looking at nascent al-Qaeda. And I'm telling you, myself as a reporter, just like all the FBI and the CIA, didn't see it. You couldn't see the photograph developing, but it was definitely developing at that point. And I think about these connections keep coming back to Egypt. There was, in the Sudan, around Osama bin Laden, Egyptian protectors. And one of them was almost certainly Ayman al-Zawahiri. Now, I didn't know him then, and I didn't know that I would recognize him, but they were together then. But I do have this searing image of bin Laden, seeing him in person, and reading a clip by Walter Pincus, a great journalist with the Washington Post. The only thing I could find on him, pre-Google, for those of you who are young, this is hard to believe there was a time before Google. But you used to have to go down to the what we called the morgue, where they had the clips. And these guys who would literally wear those visors and roll up their sleeves and have these things, and they would rip the clips from the newspaper and store them in these little packets. And I opened up a packet. And there was a packet that said, Walter Pincus had reported that bin Laden, indeed, some people think he may have financed these guys who tried to blow up the World Trade Center. But people in the CIA say that's impossible because he was our ally in Afghanistan in the war against the Soviets. He was part of the Mujahideen, the sort of freedom fighters, as they saw themselves, and as President Reagan saw them, who came from around the Arab world to fight against the Soviet Union. So if he was on the CIA payroll and he's with the Saudis, how could he be trying to blow up the World Trade Center? 1993. You could then go forward to a time where my reporting there as a police reporter, it really led to me being very interested in the Middle East. And then I became a foreign correspondent. I left the New York Daily News and I went to the Boston Globe. And there I became much more interested in the Middle East. And eventually they assigned me to become the Middle East bureau chief. Kind of an exaggerated title because the Globe only had one correspondent in the entire Middle East. So, as my wife frequently reminded me, I was the bureau chief and the entire bureau. But in this perch, I began to really look around the region. This is the mid-90s, we're talking 97 in that area. And I would frequently go to Egypt, and you would see the incredible, brutal crackdown on the Islamists. Muslim Brotherhood pushed underground. The militants are going and sort of peeling away, going to the Sudan, and then eventually going to Afghanistan. Coalescing around what would become known as al-Qaeda by 1998. We get the first quote, Ladenese epistle, where they really proclaim themselves at a war with the United States. Remember the African embassy bombings, when we first began to really see what their intent was to attack the U.S. And all of this is happening, and all of this is swirling, and all of this is taking shape. And I keep going back to Egypt. I had an office in Egypt, and I was there all the time, and I kept thinking, like, what does the United States support in Egypt? Are we supporting stability over democracy, or are we just supporting, like, Mubarak forever, and we're never going to let him hold elections, and the elections were just sham, and any opposition that would rise up would be jailed, and Muslim Brotherhood is deeply underground. They're an illegal party, but they have huge popular support because they're doing something the Egyptian government isn't doing. They're actually going out and helping people with health clinics and schools, and I think of them less as Islamists, although they certainly are Islamists in their beliefs, but I think of them also as sort of our equivalent to the ethnic Pauls of big cities, the Irish and the Italians who ruled great cities in America and went into the poor neighborhoods and took care of people and built constituencies. They also have that sort of ward boss element to them that you can't forget in Egypt. But the whole time they began to reject violence and really say they believed in democracy and secretly run party candidates. It was Ayman al-Zawahiri, the Egyptian, number 2 in al-Qaeda under bin Laden, who would say, those Muslim Brotherhood are fools. They say they believe in democracy, but if they ever get a chance to really run and they win, the West will never allow them to rule. And I heard this all through the 90s, 97, 98, 99, 2000. It's just a constant theme. And then, of course, the expression of al-Qaeda reaches its most dark and its most unexpected expression on September 11th, 2001, attacks on the United States. And suddenly all of that picture comes sharply into focus. You know, I remember calling my desk and thinking, they did it. You know, I couldn't believe they did it. They tried to take down the World Trade Center in 1993, and 8 years later, they succeeded. And in that 8 years of intervening time, I kept going through Egypt and seeing how far down the Islamists were pushed, how the expressions were popping out on the sides with people like al-Zawahiri. These things, as we look back in our history, are connected. But I think maybe a jumping off point could also be fast forward. We know about the wars of September 11th, Afghanistan. We know about very ill-fated war in Iraq. After President Bush, after mission accomplished, after the many mistakes that were made in the aftermath of September 11th, it was in 2009, we launched Global Post as a new online international news organization in the same month that President Obama took office and had his famous inaugural speech. Then go forward to June 2009, his first major foreign policy speech from abroad. And he goes to Cairo University in Egypt, and he speaks beautifully and eloquently of democracy as a universal ideal. And he says to the Muslim world, after these many years post 9/11 of violence, of us confronting the threat to our country, experiencing war as a result, he goes forward and he says, we reach out to you with open hands. And that was a very famous phrase, the open hands. The United States reaches with open hands to the Muslim world. We want to have a new start, and we believe in democracy. Now, I think the Arab world heard that, and I think they began to organize right around that time. And that's when a lot of the Facebook pages and the opposition against Mubarak, against a lot of the autocrats of the Middle East really began. And I don't think they're disconnected. You don't hear the White House claim very often that it was responsible for the Arab Spring. They don't take credit for that. It's political dynamite to take credit for that. But if you go back and we look as historians back at this time, I think you'd have to say that was an important turning point. If you fast forward now to the events of Tunisia in the end of 2010, when a fruit peddler just stands up and he says he's tired of the corruption, and Tunisia suddenly erupts in demonstrations and calls for democracy, and before you know it, the autocrat there is toppled, and eyes turn toward Egypt, and suddenly Tahrir Square begins to fill up with demonstrators. I was in Afghanistan when this was happening, and I had this big interview with General Petraeus, pre-scandal General Petraeus, and I had followed him greatly and had huge respect, and still have so much respect for so many of the ways he has thought about post-9/11 world. And there is nothing like being on a big assignment like that and knowing you are in exactly the wrong place. I'm arriving in Afghanistan, watching Tunisia, and then small demonstrations beginning in Egypt, and I was thinking, this could be really exciting. So I go to see Petraeus for the interview, and he looks at me and he says, "What are you doing here? Shouldn't you be in Egypt?" Next morning, we get a call from Frontline, PBS Frontline, and they say, "We really want you to go to Egypt to work with us in partnership on a documentary." So we did. And really, I got there about day 3 of the street demonstrations and never left Tahrir Square. And I don't know, how many of you really watched that? How many of you followed that? Okay. That was an amazing thing to watch. It was more amazing to be there on the streets, inside the tents, with all the mud and the garbage and the smells and the plastic sheeting and the rain and the demonstrations and the incredible sense of hope. What an expression that was. I've been a journalist for 30 years. That is the single most surprising and hopeful thing I had ever covered in my career. Covered a lot of war, I've covered a lot of big stories, but that one was the most unpredictable. And I'm not the only one who feels that way. Tom Friedman feels that way. Many of the journalists who've got a lot of experience covering the Middle East would say that moment was extraordinary in a way that no other was before it. Out of that hope came a sense that maybe this could really happen. Maybe Egypt will indeed have a democracy. But we know what happened. It began to unfold. Suddenly, Mubarak steps down. The protesters rejoice. Very soon after that, the military sort of begins to take hold, and it says, okay, we'll be this interim government for now, the SCAF, the sort of committee of generals who were running Egypt, said, we're going to have a decent transition to democracy. They were seen as heroes in the revolution because they came to the side of the protesters, and they said, we embrace this call for change. So they were seen as heroic, and they are still, even to this day, from all polling, considered the most trusted institution in Egypt, which can be very surprising if you're watching on the streets the way in which they are acting so brutally and putting down the demonstrations, and how the Egyptians cling to this. Or is it just faulty polling? I don't know. But if you talk to Egyptians, they still hold out a lot of hope for their military to be part of a transition to democracy. On the streets, that was very hard to see. I wanted to go to the real starting point for this conversation, which is a clip from a documentary that we did last summer. This is the second documentary we did with Frontline. The first one chronicled the fall of Mubarak, the way in which Tahrir Square was formed, how the demonstrators came together. Part 2, the second-hour documentary, was broadcast in September, and it really was about the fall of Morsi and how that happened. So I'm going to show you a clip from that film as a way to get us going right into the conversation here.
Later that night, Abbas and I were caught up in a pro-Morsi protest headed towards Tahrir Square. The march was blocked by police. Rock throwing, tear gas, and shots followed.
Come on! Tear gas landing.
By the end of the evening, another 7 protesters were dead. These confrontations were quickly becoming almost daily affairs.
Both sides appear to be allowing this violence to go on. And this, in a way, allows the military to say the Brotherhood are criminals and they all need to be locked up. At the same time, I don't understand why Brotherhood leaders are ordering marches, putting the lives of their own supporters at risk.
The next day, at the Rabaa al-Adawiya Mosque, the Muslim Brotherhood held a press conference. They had wheeled out the wounded and praised their martyrs to a room full of reporters. I asked Muslim Brotherhood leader Mohammed Beltagi about the criticism that they were intentionally putting their supporters at risk.
There are people on the military side who say that this is a strategy by the Muslim Brotherhood to create martyrs for the movement.
It is strange that you are saying that a peaceful protester benefits from being killed, but you do not address who is doing the killing. Who else in the world can attack peaceful protesters? Do you want me to go home and surrender and tell myself that our reality is a military coup? I have a right to protest peacefully and reject this military coup.
Okay, the United States did not call it a military coup. The United States couldn't call it a military coup because the second they called it a military coup, they have to cut off aid to the Egyptian military. But if you were there that summer and you saw the events transpire, it's very difficult to call it anything but that. I mean, if you look up the dictionary definition of coup, it would definitely fit. We sat there on the streets of Egypt watching all of this unfold. The demonstrations of June 30th were extraordinary in the way they were a huge outpouring, just as powerful, if not more powerful in terms of numbers on the street, against President Morsi, who had been democratically elected. He came out of the Muslim Brotherhood's party. He wins the election. In the parliamentary elections before the presidential election, Muslim Brotherhood Party, the Freedom and Justice Party, had done extremely well. They had won 40% of the seats in parliament, and other Islamist groups had won 20%. That's 60% of the parliament represented by Islamists. You now have Morsi, who is elected. He stays in office for less than a year, and in late June 2013, the Egyptians decide they're fed up with the government of Morsi. They feel that it has failed governance. They had certainly done a very poor job. They may be good at organizing people, good at organizing different pockets of poverty in Cairo, but the people of Egypt felt they were doing a terrible job. And people I know in Egypt called it an impeachment from the street. And they said it's no different than when we took down Mubarak, we're going to take down Morsi and we're going to impeach him from the street because he's rammed forward a constitution that doesn't respect the rights of minorities, Christians. It doesn't respect women. And it doesn't have any of the sort of secular ideals that so many Egyptians want that country to have, particularly those who made Tahrir Square happen as a revolution. So we ended up with massive demonstrations. On July 3rd, that 4th of July weekend, while the president is on vacation and the Secretary of State is on vacation, there is a very quiet move to give Morsi a clear ultimatum. Either you step down willingly and call for new elections, or we're going to take you into custody. I don't think arrest is a fair word. Morsi says, I'm not going to step down. I'm the democratically elected president. Egyptian military moves in and arrests the president and puts him in an undisclosed location. He's not able to talk to his family or to anyone else. And they begin a complete crackdown on the Muslim Brotherhood. And that is that scene that you just watched. That is where we arrive on the scene and begin to see what's really happening with the Muslim Brotherhood. There was incredible force shown by the military to the Muslim Brotherhood protesters. There were hundreds of Muslim Brotherhood protesters who were gunned down. These were civilians who were protesting, and they were shot in the street. There was a lot of indiscriminate fire. There is one day where it is estimated that hundreds were killed, over 400. These are big numbers that have never really been accounted for.
Later that night,
maybe you can help me with this next clip if you could. The thing that is hard to understand now is where is this going to head? Morsi is now facing charges. He's now in prison, and he's going on trial for the charges against him. Most of the people we interviewed in this film, including Beltagi, who you saw, who was one of the Muslim Brotherhood leaders, are all in prison. There have been hundreds and hundreds of opposition locked up, 25 journalists locked up, 3 Al Jazeera journalists locked up, another journalist was locked up today. Most of the people I interviewed who were part of the opposition, both secular and Islamists from the Muslim Brotherhood, are locked up. They are locking up the opposition, and they're pushing forward with the May 25, 26 elections and proclaiming it a democracy. The United States really did not say anything on July 3rd when Morsi was locked up. There was a stunning silence. There has since then been a very uncomfortable silence. Now, I had a chance to talk with a very senior level State Department official who was very much involved in this process, who said to me, these are fair observations, but there was a lot going on behind the scenes that you don't know about. But behind the scenes doesn't work. The United States had called out, this President of the United States had said in Cairo, democracy is a universal right. And it did very little when the military moved in and took over. Now, Muslim Brotherhood failed governance. Muslim Brotherhood, not what the United States would want. Muslim Brotherhood has a lot to answer for. The Muslim Brotherhood, in the end of the day, may not embrace democracy, and that has its own peril, and I accept all of that. But I think we lost an opportunity to try to hold up the institutions of democracy and to try to have a teaching moment with Egypt that you elected this guy, and now you need to find your way to legally remove him from power through democracy. Instead, it became the street rules. And I think we've undercut that message that President Obama so powerfully and eloquently expressed in June of 2009, which I think really set a lot of this in motion. So we end up now with a situation where we don't know where it's going to go. We know that Morsi appointed as Secretary of Defense a very high-ranking and very popular general, young general for Egyptian standards. He's 59 years old. And he is General al-Sisi. General al-Sisi recently stepped down. You probably heard about that in the news, and he said he's going to run for president. That's no surprise. And General al-Sisi will almost inevitably be elected in these elections. There's no one who's predicting anyone else who could win. When al-Sisi does take office, one of the things that will inevitably happen is the deep state will get deeper. The deep state is a phrase you hear all the time in Egypt. And I want to share with you one more clip so you can get a sense of what is the deep state. And then I'm going to conclude and we'll go right to questions.
ستعود المؤسسات المنتخبة لأداء دورها.
Revolutionaries and liberals who voted for Morsi hoped the new president and a new constitution would restrain Egypt's deep state.
One of the big demands of the Egyptian revolution was to say, we don't want any more torture, we don't want any more abuse by the security services, we don't want any more civilians being tried in military courts, and so forth and so on.
We wanted to have something in the Constitution against torture. We wanted to have something in the Constitution against police brutality. We wanted to have something in the Constitution that would limit the power of the military. But rather than curb the power of the military, the Constitution gave the military everything they wanted.
Basically, what the Constitution guaranteed for the military was safe passage so that none of them were held accountable for their violations of our rights during the junta rule, the SCAF rule, left the military budget untouched, left any kind of civilian oversight of that budget, and allowed the military to continue to put civilians before military tribunals, which were all things that, we, the revolution, wanted to fix.
The fatal mistake is that the Muslim Brotherhood could have turned to us, the revolutionary, and could have turned to Tahrir and to tell them, we need you to write a constitution that would limit the power of the military. We need you to curb and cleanse the very corrupt judiciary. We would have come to his rescue. And instead, he tried to flirt with the police and the military against us.
For any leader, curbing the military would have been hard. In Egypt, the military is more than an army. It's big business, controlling as much as 40% of the economy. They make cars, chemicals, bottled water, and even bread. The full extent of their empire is unknown.
The military is one of the top landowners in the country, and you can't even really get a proper list of military-associated industries. And the military wants to preserve its perks, its privileges, its significant private sector economic empire, and they want to escape from civilian oversight.
So we're left in this moment with the military back in charge, a general ascendant back into power, and it's easy to say Egypt's right back where we started. Mubarak was a general, and now we have a new general who will take over. There is no possibility for civilian democracy in Egypt. Maybe Egypt's not ready for democracy. That's one of my favorite phrases. Egypt's not ready for democracy. Or maybe we're not ready for Egypt's democracy. They elected a leader. We did not support any of the democratic institutions that could have been upheld when that leader was imprisoned, locked up, put on trial on trumped-up charges. So if we're going to play a role in the world where we're going to encourage democracy, then you have to live up to it. You have to believe in it, and you have to support it, whether you like it or not, whether you like who's been put in power or you don't. I'm going to tell you truthfully, maybe this is a little too editorial, but I don't like the Muslim Brotherhood. I wouldn't want to live under their leadership. But I think Egypt deserves better than a choice between a military junta and a theocracy. And the sound of Tahrir Square was the sound of people saying, we want democracy. And that sound that toppled Mubarak in Tahrir Square was the same sound that echoed in June 2013 when they shouted down Morsi and they said, we don't want a theocracy either. The question of the day, as we go toward the election in which al-Sisi will almost inevitably win, is does al-Sisi, the general who you saw riding right next to Morsi there, that was him riding alongside him. It was his Secretary of Defense. He is the general right on his right-hand shoulder. Did General al-Sisi hear that sound? Did he hear the sound of how much hope there is in the voice of Egypt in the streets? Did he hear the sound of democracy? Because if he didn't, history is going to roll over him as well. I think there's an inevitable spirit now in the Middle East, which is exciting, but it's going to greatly challenge American foreign policy. That balance between stability and democracy is right on the line. Which do we believe in? Which one? Because if you really believe in democracy, you might have instability. And as we've learned, going for stability, if it leads to tyranny, ends up with instability and volatility. So that's a false sense of stability. So I do not envy those in the world, both the Egyptian leadership, our own State Department, and all of the other leaders in the world who have to figure this out or help Egypt figure it out. Because these are really hard questions. It's a very difficult equation, but I think there's a lot at stake, and you need to watch this one. You have to watch what happens right now in Egypt. And the operative question I'd like you to keep in mind is, did General al-Sisi hear the sound of democracy? And does the United States hear the sound of democracy right now in the Middle East? Thank you.
We open the floor for questions. I will take 3 questions at a time and then give the floor to our speaker to respond. So, and please limit your question to a question and not a long comment, at least, because we would like to have everyone participate here. Yes.
Yes. Thank you for an excellent.
May I ask you also to introduce yourself? So I'd love to know who you are.
My name is Imad Zikri. I'm originally from Egypt, and I run an investment management firm here in Manhattan. Thank you very much for an excellent talk, an excellent speech. And the one puzzle to me is really outside Egypt. It resides here in Washington, D.C. How can the United States not declare this a military coup? And when you talk to senior officials in administration, they say, we have geopolitical interests in Egypt. We want to maintain our relationship. Where in fact, they've lost Egypt, in my opinion, 100%. The Muslim Brotherhood feels they didn't support them. The military feels they didn't send a strong signal supporting their movement to remove Morsi. And Egypt now is in the Russian camp for all practical purposes. How can the United States justify this, since 80% of the aid they give Egypt goes to the military?
You know, it's a fantastic question, supported by a great deal of fact and I think very accurate insight about where we are right now. One of the things to remember is, remember when I said for years Ayman al-Zawahiri, now the head of Al-Qaeda, said the Muslim Brotherhood are suckers? They believe in democracy, and as soon as they get elected, the West will never allow them to rule. All over the Middle East right now, Al-Qaeda is rippling with "I told you so." And they're telling all of those Islamists who believed in democracy, we told you you were suckers, that that's a Western game, that's a fool's errand. And I think that is one of the great things the United States failed to recognize in not calling this a coup, and in not encouraging Egypt to find some democratic institutions through which they could remove what was very clearly a government that was failing, a government that was not delivering a good constitution. The Muslim Brotherhood's political party was successful in the polls. It reflected a deep yearning of the Egyptian people for change, but it was failed governance, particularly in terms of economy. There was no plan that Morsi seemed to have to really try to restart the economy. He was not instilling confidence. And he wasn't brave enough, as the film points out, to take on the military, to be more transparent about what it's doing with all of that industry that it runs, all of that land that it owns, all of the development that it's doing. This makes the military-industrial complex look like a joke. In Egypt, it is the economy. It's 40% of the economy. You said that you're a businessman, and I think the greatest hope for Egypt will be if it can succeed in bringing its economy back. We talked about this, Mustafa, before the talk tonight. The economy is the future. Really believe that if you can get the economy moving again, if you can get jobs, if young people who are so full of a desire for change can see some of that change come through economic progress, that has a chance to really bring Egypt forward. If El-Sisi sees that, if he becomes a technocrat who actually helps Egypt move and transition with some speed, he can't take too long on this, to begin to have the military be transparent, to begin to transition out of some of the industry that it owns. I see you shaking your head. I know it's a long shot, but if he does that, and we all have to hope that he will, because that's the only way I think he can succeed in helping Egypt move toward democracy, and then he recognizes that he needs to get out of the way. Okay, that is a little bit of hope that we can hold on to. But again, I come back to that sound. It's never going away. I have heard it on the streets of Egypt. I don't think you can have that loud of an expression for democracy and it just goes away. It's going to keep coming. And we need to get on the right side of history, I think. Yes?
For 3 years and then came back to the World Trade Center.
Yep. I think there's a microphone right there.
Given how much power resides in religious organizations in the Middle East, is it possible for democracy to take hold when, if the people were to rebel against the government, it seems to just create a power vacuum for the religious organizations to take over instead, and so the people, in effect, would have two very large, powerful organizations that they would have to kind of rebel against before they would ever really have a democracy.
You've lived in Saudi Arabia, you said?
For 2.5 years.
So in Saudi Arabia, that's true.
I traveled a little bit throughout.
There's a theocracy.
Much more there.
There's a theocracy in Saudi Arabia that you're absolutely right will continually thwart democracy. The House of Saud is a theocratic royal family that will never allow a democracy to really come forward. So you're right, but we don't hear the United States complain about that. When is the last time you heard the United States call for democracy in Saudi Arabia? When is the last time we've actually taken our ideals, so beautifully expressed, particularly by this president, in a way that resonates around the world, and for which I have tremendous respect? But if you don't begin to live up to it and say we're for democracy over stability, it rings hollow everywhere else. So in the Middle East right now, the countries that are experiencing the post-Arab Spring every country has a different story. You really can't make very many generalizations about the region, I think, right now. Tunisia, we were talking about very successfully moving forward. They elected an Islamist Brotherhood, Muslim Brotherhood party, but they also got rid of them, and they have now moved much more toward a technocratic party. But they didn't do it by thwarting democratic means. They did it within democratic means. So Tunisia, interesting example of possible success. Small steps, but at least steps forward. Libya, the war, terrible, basket case. Militias now run the place. Syria, tragedy. The black hole of the region right now in terms of the number of people who are dead and displaced. It is one of the great tragedies of the Middle East in our lifetime to watch what's happening in Syria. Egypt, they don't want to hear the United States sort of preach to them about how it's possible that the Islamists as a religious theocracy thwarted democracy. I mean, we've lost our moral authority there. We don't have that ability to make that argument anymore. And that hypocrisy, if I could say that, is just coming to the surface. And I think it's a time for all of us in the long aftermath of the longest war in American history, after September 11th, and if we do indeed see the troops come home from Afghanistan, the drawdown, as President Obama has called for it, if we see that and we're really at the end of the long war, as it's sometimes called, it is really time to think about how we're going to live up to these ideals we proclaim. Because it's going to be a challenge. It's going to be a tough foreign policy equation. It's going to challenge our notions of what is democracy. And is it possible that Islamists could be democratic or not? We see it in Turkey. Okay, now they're kind of going back and they're starting to have their own crackdown in Turkey. Indonesia, we have seen one of the most successful democracies in the Muslim world thrive, and the Islamists play a role there. Why is it that we think Islamists can't be part of democracy any more than Christian fundamentalists are part of American democracy? We have to get sophisticated about the expressions of faith in different parts of the world and how they're going to inform governance. And I think we've lacked that sophistication. And I think the people I know in the State Department, there are some really smart people. And they are people who believe in what they're doing. And they are very well intentioned. And they are not being listened to back in Washington. One of my favorite things to ask a political officer is, they know who opens their cables. It's an internet system in which they can know if they put forward a cable back to Washington about the current situation, how many people open it. And I can't tell you how many people I know who are brilliant, who really know the street, who really know what we at Global Post call ground truth, which is about being there, which is about speaking the language, which is about knowing the story. That ground truth, as embodied in the cables, they go unopened. So we need a State Department that has more expertise, more knowledge, more history, and a better ear for listening to the ground. We keep missing the story. And I think it's a great challenge. These are not easy questions. I don't envy, as I said, those who have to figure them out. And I respect the way so many good people are trying. But we've got to collectively pay much closer attention to these issues. Sir. We may actually, I might, if I may, say we've had two men. Maybe we could have the lady ask a question first. Is that okay? That's fine. And we'll come back to you. Thank you for being a gentleman.
Now the pressure's on.
Yeah.
Being weaned in the Midwest with the idea of the founding fathers and, a bunch of guys that had disagreements, but basically they had a shared cause.
Mm-hmm.
When I see, to me what strikes me in all of these countries is the incredible factionalism, and that, in a democracy, I think you can't only just desire freedom, but desire tolerance. Mm-hmm. And I respect the Islam, this has nothing to do with thinking they're wrong or whatever. It just has to do with looking how the whole political thing goes. Talk about unpacking history for hundreds of years. How will that inform their idea of democracy? Can we ever understand that idea of democracy? I mean, how does that all come together? Even the Taliban, when they would affiliate with various tribal leaders, then would not let them have any shared.
Yeah.
So it goes on and on.
Don't forget, did you say from the Midwest? Yeah. So, I mean, coming from the heartland of America, it's really important to remember when the first people from Europe arrived on the shores of this land, they were driven by religion. They were looking for religious freedom. They were searching for business as well, and it was very mercenary and mercantile. But it was also about an expression of religious freedom. The founding fathers, as they put together the Constitution and fought against the British, were really also talking not only about, no taxation without representation. They were also talking about freedom from the crown, from a kind of dry, set hold on religion that they resisted. And remember, the wall that was created so poetically in our Constitution, dividing church and state, wasn't meant to push the church out of life. It was meant to allow it to thrive and live within the democracy. And I think we've come up with a good formula that really, when we do it right, which isn't very often, but when we do it right, it can work beautifully. It's a great, beautiful description of how to think that through. But it wasn't meant to shut religion out. It was meant to allow it to grow naturally outside of the governance of the state. It's a different model in the Middle East, and Islam is a different religion. And Islam believes a lot in how it is part of your whole life, including systems of governance. And we have to recognize that. And we have to encourage those streams of Islam that are looking at it that way and invite them into democracy. And you had one in the Muslim Brotherhood, and I'd argue you don't anymore. You had a massive movement in Egypt that thought, we really believe in democracy. We're Islamists, but we believe in democracy. Look what happened to them. You saw it. So the guy in the beginning of the film, when I say Muhammad Abbas and I moved towards Tahrir Square, and you see that guy, that guy's a kid who is so classic. He's like my muse in Egypt. He is from a very poor part of Cairo. His father died young of hepatitis, and not just like, do you know how bad your healthcare system has to be for you to die of hepatitis? I mean, it's pretty bad. And it happens often in Egypt. The Muslim Brotherhood in that poor neighborhood hears about this family in which the father has died, left behind a boy and his two sisters who are young, and it moves in and it begins to help them. And that Muslim Brotherhood gets his sisters in nursery school, helps him with some of the bills at home. His mother now needs him to go to work, and he works in a printing press. And he's like so many Egyptians. But he never forgot that the Muslim Brotherhood did something for him when his father died when he was young and helped out the family. So he's in the Muslim Brotherhood when it's outlawed. And then suddenly Tahrir Square happens. And he is among those leaders who bring the old guard Muslim Brotherhood, who are just as sort of sclerotic as the military. And he brings them and he says, you've got to be part of this revolution. So it's the Muslim Brotherhood youth, which he embodies, that bring the Muslim Brotherhood into the revolution. And he's one of the first guys to say to the military, you need to support this. We got on to him about day 5 on the ground in Tahrir Square, and he turned out to be an amazing story because he is the person in Tahrir Square who leads the chant on the night that Mubarak is forced to step down. And the chant was, the people, the army, hand in hand. The people, the army, hand in hand. He believed this was going to happen. The Muslim Brotherhood and the military would move forward with the secular protesters in Tahrir Square, and there would be a new Egypt. He quit the Muslim Brotherhood in disgust when he saw how they led. And he began to believe in some new centrist party that maybe could bring people together. They got crushed in the elections. He ran for the lower house of parliament. He was wiped out because the big Muslim Brotherhood party swamped him. He then became so disillusioned with the militaries, it began to really crack down in the streets, and now he no longer believes in the military. And Mohammed Abbas stands for me as this person who represents where Egypt is right now. He has not lost hope, but he is despairing, and he has fled the country fearing arrest, because anyone who is part of the opposition is being arrested. And he did not want to get arrested. So he has left the country. And in his travels, he came to the United States, and he spoke to some important people in Washington on an off-the-record basis. And those important people in Washington, I think, listen to him, because I've talked to them, and they hear in him something that doesn't get expressed. It's too in the middle, it's too nuanced, but it's really important. So when I hear that Mohammed Abbas was in Washington, he has given me so much of his time. I said, why don't you come, and I want to show you around Boston, where Global Post is based, where I am from. I wanted to take him to Fenway, but I didn't. Instead, I took him to see the Freedom Trail and the history of the American Revolution, because I kept telling him Tahrir Square is like the Boston Massacre. So I took him to the old State House where the Boston Massacre happened, the first real violent demonstration against the British Crown, how that led to the events that would eventually become Paul Revere's Ride, and I took him to Old North Church, and then I took him out through Lexington and into Concord, and he was amazed, and he was really taking in the history. And his comment as we were driving to the airport after this sort of 3-hour odyssey through Boston was, so your revolution took almost 15 years, and we're on year 3. Give us some time. And that's why I remain hopeful. I think the people who really believe that change is inevitable in Egypt and who are thinking positively about what that could mean understand it's going to take time. But I think it's incumbent upon us in the United States, where we have had such a dramatic role in the Middle East, both for our own use of its oil, for our own implementation of different military aid that has propped up a lot of regimes that didn't believe in democracy, while we spoke from such lofty terms about democracy. I think we all owe it to pay a lot closer attention now to the voice of people like Mohammed Abbas. Sir, and you are a gentleman. Thank you.
My name is Ed Houlihan. I am the moderator of the Ridgewood, New Jersey Great Decision Discussion Group. Very simple question.
Yes.
Where would Egypt be today if Morsi was still in power?
It's a great question, and I don't know the answer, other than to say...
Speculate.
Okay, I mean, I would say the speculation would be that the failed governance that Morsi was executing was so dramatic that the people would have continued to rise up against that, and there would have been an inevitable motion in which he would have been removed from power. The question is, how would he be removed from power? I can embrace the phrase impeachment from the street. It's genuinely felt. These are people who believe really they're secular and they just didn't want this theocracy. And they feel very strongly that they don't want any Western correspondents like me coming in and telling them you have to allow the democratic government of the Muslim Brotherhood under Morsi to rule your country. They were like fed up. But I just think, to answer your question, we would have had an inevitable process of rising street demonstrations against the rule of the Muslim Brotherhood, and we would have seen them removed from power. What role could the US government have played in helping a nascent democracy find a way to do that, not with the military, not with tanks, and not at the point of a gun? But how could we have helped them do that within the democratic institutions that we proclaim we believe in and we want to see go forward? lost opportunity. I think we have one last question, maybe. Okay, in the back.
Yes, ma'am.
I just have a simple question.
Sure.
When you're talking about when they, with the initial revolution in the election, if the majority of the people on the street eventually were going to vote against Morsi and that theocracy, then voting them in the first place, do they expect something different? Or whether or not it's viable candidate to vote in?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's complicated because when Morsi ran, there were only two candidates. Sort of by the technical aspects of how they put forward their candidates, they ended up, at the end of the day, with Morsi representing the Freedom and Justice Party and the Muslim Brotherhood, but people who were at least in Tahrir Square. And the other candidate was what they call Falul, or the remnant of the regime under Mubarak. And that was really hearkening back to the past. And they didn't want that. So there were a lot of secular people who held their nose and voted for Morsi, rather than have the old Mubarak regime restored. Complex vote, not a huge democratic mandate for Morsi. In parliament, yes, but not for Morsi in the executive. But the thing that we need to pay very close attention to in the media is there is a large country. Egypt is the most populous nation in the Arab world. It has vast tracts of rural land that think very differently than the urban pockets of Alexandria and Cairo where correspondents go. And usually we only go to Cairo, truthfully. Very rarely do we get into Sohag, which is like the Detroit of Egypt, or do we get into the Delta, which is sort of like this I would compare it maybe to the South and to sort of the Carolinas and the southern farm-growing states, farm states where you have rural populations that think differently and that often have their sons and daughters, well, their sons in this case, their sons go into the military. And the military becomes something that gives them a chance at learning, at developing a profession, and because they control so much of the economy, getting a job. So it's become something that they believe in, and we don't hear that voice often enough. And that's the voice that I think is supporting Morsi, a sort of silent majority, if you will, out there in the parts of Egypt that we're not seeing or hearing enough of, and many right there in Cairo who grew tired of the theocratic tyranny, as many of them saw it, of the Muslim Brotherhood, and just the chaos. One of the things that struck me in reporting in Egypt is we have these cameras with Frontline, and we would pan to a shot, and we would hold on the shot, and people from the neighborhood would swarm us, and we wouldn't know why they were suddenly so mad at us. We'd have to calm them down, really work to hear what they were saying, and we would realize it's because they thought we were filming the trash on the streets, and they didn't want the world to see Egypt as a place that has trash, because during the revolution there was no trash collection. And the pride that Egyptians have in their country is extraordinary. I think the pride they have in their sense that they are a very sophisticated part of the world that is the birthplace of mankind, that goes back thousands of years, that has great sophistication and great role in the world as the mother of the earth or the mother of mankind. And they see themselves as the cradle of civilization. And they're proud. And they don't want the country to go downhill. So I think we're gonna see now with al-Sisi an opportunity for Egypt to regroup and to live up to that expression that you heard in Tahrir Square, which was like so heartwarming that I still get goosebumps when I think about it. There were people chanting, "Hold your head up now, you're an Egyptian." So that thought is a wonderful one to end on, because that is how so many Egyptian people feel. They want to hold their heads up and they want to be proud to be Egyptian. I think our country, the United States, has a huge responsibility in supporting them in that.
Before we end,
Thank you.
You mentioned Tunisia and the comparison between the relative success, and I would say today the success of the Tunisian experience and the failure of the Egyptian experience. I think the main difference here is that on one hand, you had a middle class, large middle class, an educated country with the ownership of lodging. About 80% of the population owns its whether house or apartment or whatever. The country majority has been for centuries secular, with a very open interpretation of Islam, the Maliki madhab, or if you wish, doctrine in Islam. That was something that the Tunisians held dear. The Muslim Brotherhood, or rather the offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, the Islamists, the Nahda in Tunisia, gets elected with a relative majority, and instead of taking the chance of reforming the economy, of confronting some of the problems that the country faced, for which the youth suffered for a long time, etc., the first thing they do, and their agenda was clear on this, was to change Tunisia's identity by introducing a Sharia and the constitution, by doing a number of things that Tunisians rejected. And it took them 2 years with political assassinations, with revolts and huge demonstrations of the street, particularly women. In one of the demonstrations, you had almost 500,000 women coming down to the street and saying, "You cannot touch our rights," and change the constitution or write a new constitution that will not respect the rights that we have gained for so long. But that did not have any effect on them. And in the end, they saw the writing on the wall with the fall of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and the turbulence in Turkey, because that was also for them an ideal to sell Islamic democracy and so on. And then they came begging, practically begging, the secular opposition to arrive at an arrangement, and they gave up power. The question today that is asked by analysts and by scholars is whether they would have accepted to leave power on their own if things did not go badly in Egypt. This is a question for you, and I will leave that question for your thoughts. Thank you very much.